A small store with dim neon lights and a cold atmosphere. James Hart entered without a greeting, no smile, just a heavy silence. His appearance was far from the luxurious image many had of the brand he built. Dressed in casual jeans and a plain shirt, James walked straight to the pastry counter, unnoticed. He had one request: an apple pie. The pie looked delicious with its golden crust, just freshly baked, releasing a fragrant aroma. James took a fork, sliced a piece, and brought it to his mouth. The taste was familiar, like the pies his mother used to make. But as soon as he swallowed the first bite, he knew it wasn't the pie his mother made. This apple pie wasn't from Golden Hearth. It was a counterfeit, a product made to resemble a family recipe, but filled with deception in every bite. James didn't get angry, didn't push the table. He simply pulled out his phone, preparing to document what he was about to do. He knew that sometimes even the smallest detail of the truth could not be ignored. In the quiet atmosphere, with the counterfeit pie in his mouth, James wondered, if it were you, what would you do? Would you stay silent and swallow the disappointment, or would you stand up and uncover the truth? And even if only you knew, would you speak out? These questions weren't just for him, but for anyone in a similar situation, where everything was not as it seemed. James sat silently, not in a hurry to leave. He observed. A family entered, no greeting, no warm welcome, just quick glances at the menu, and an empty atmosphere around them. This store no longer carried the warmth of its early days, now replaced with indifference. James noticed stains on the counter, fingerprints on the glass, marks no one bothered to clean, no one cared about. It was a sign of emotional neglect, a lack of care in the work. This store was no longer what he had founded, a place that started with a small shop, traditional apple pies, pride, and relentless effort. It had become a place where the managers and staff no longer felt enthusiasm, self-respect, or love for their craft. James saw it not just in the dirt on the counter, but in the staff's eyes and their indifference. At that moment, everything became clear. This wasn't a store that had made a small mistake. This was a system slowly losing its essence, a place abandoned, forgetting its core values. And James, with his love for the craft, was ready to change it all. James sat quietly in the corner, his eyes never leaving the scene around him. No one paid attention to him, and that was exactly what he wanted. He didn't need to stand out. He didn't need to make loud statements or reactions. He just needed to watch, to observe carefully what was happening around him. The staff behind the counter didn't greet anyone. They just looked down at the table, their hands lightly tapping on the counter as if they were lazily counting down time. After a while, a man entered, his posture timid, exhausted. He stood still at the counter, hesitant to approach. The pastry counter was no longer the proud place it once was. This store had become cold, where no one really cared about the customers, where every action from the staff exuded indifference. From the corner of the counter, a sharp shout pierced the silence. "Maya, why does that tray look like a mess?" Troy Harkins, a manager here, shouted in a harsh, brutal tone. Maya, the new employee, lowered her head, her hands trembling as she tried to hand over the tray of pastries to a customer. The customers around her didn't dare look, glancing awkwardly at each other as if they didn't want to get involved in this awkward situation. James couldn't ignore it. Every word he heard, every action, imprinted itself in his memory. He had seen the early days when everyone poured their heart into the job, when every employee was proud to talk about their products, where there was no fear, only passion. Now what had changed? How had a store that he had poured so much effort into ended up in this state? He no longer just watched. He saw the cracks in the system, the clear signs of fragmentation and decay. It wasn't just a failure in the work, it was a failure of the core value: care and respect for customers, for the people who had helped him build this brand. As Maya lowered her head and left, James knew one thing. It wasn't just her who was suffering, it was the entire store. And what he had just witnessed was not just a failure of one individual, but of the whole system. James's gaze hardened. What he saw was not just poor service, but the decaying of the values this store once stood for. A little apple pie, a little respect, but now all of it had been lost. James knew he could not sit still any longer. He had to act. Only when the true nature of everything was brought to light could he restore this store. Not just about the pies, but about trust, fairness, and most importantly, the people. James looked around, feeling a rising sense of unease in his chest. This store had once been his pride, a place where values like care, hospitality, and honesty were paramount. But now everything seemed the complete opposite. He could feel the gloom in the air, as if everyone in this store was wearing a mask, hiding the truths they didn't want to face. The staff avoided eye contact, the customers silent like ghosts, no one daring to speak up. Only the thick silence remained, as if fear had seeped into every corner of this space. Troy Harkins continued to shout, but this time, he wasn't just scolding Maya. He turned to Evan, who was cleaning the stains on the counter. Evan, don't stand there like there's nothing to do. If you keep going like this, you'll never get the work done. His voice wasn't just disrespectful, but also contemptuous and indifferent. The others didn't dare look at Evan. They all tried to avoid his gaze, as if they didn't want to get involved in a situation they couldn't change. But James couldn't stay silent anymore. He stood up, walked slowly toward the counter, where Evan was bowing his head. People around him started to notice him. There were no words, just James's sharp gaze, cutting through everyone, leaving no one unnoticed. When James got closer to Evan, he placed a hand on his shoulder, gently but firmly. Evan looked up, his eyes filled with fatigue and worry, but there was no resistance. James smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile, but one filled with understanding and determination. He looked back at the counter, where the stains still hadn't been cleaned, where everything seemed neglected and forgotten. Everything here was signaling a truth James couldn't ignore anymore. This store was no longer the one he had built. It had been taken over by indifference, deceit, and a system that only cared about profit without regard for human value. He turned back to look at Maya, who was still standing by the counter, her eyes welling up, but she wasn't crying. She was just silently enduring the humiliation, unable to fight back. James could clearly see what was going on in her mind. The fear, the helplessness, all of it had gradually eaten her away, making her forget that she too deserved respect. James stood silently for a moment, then looked at the window where the weak light from outside shone in, creating a hazy atmosphere. He knew he couldn't let things continue like this. This wasn't just about pies or store management. This was about respect, self-respect, and whether people like Maya, like Evan, and like all the other employees were not just puppets to be controlled by others. "It's time for change," James whispered, as if he were speaking to himself. And when he turned to look at the staff around him, he knew this change couldn't start with anyone else but him. James sat back down at the table near the window, carefully observing every detail in the store. He wasn't in a rush, but looking intently at what was happening around him. The light from outside illuminated the stains on the counter, the signs of neglect and lack of care. This wasn't just a store that was dirty. This was a place where values had been forgotten and indifference had seeped to its core. While the employees continued to work in silence, avoiding eye contact with each other, James noticed something more important than the dirt on the counter or Troy's scolding. It was the silence. It was thick enough to be felt, like an invisible wall between him and everyone else in the store. He remembered the early days when he opened this store. Things hadn't always been easy, but he always felt proud that he could offer customers not just delicious pies, but a warm and welcoming space. A space where anyone who stepped in felt like part of the family. But now all he saw was coldness, distance, and a culture where people only existed to survive, not to work with passion. James knew that if he continued to remain silent, if he continued to let this indifference and contempt persist, everything would fall apart. But he also knew that what he was witnessing wasn't just the result of a few mistakes. This was a system that had rotted from within. And then he found his first clue. While sitting and observing, a staff member came out of the office carrying a freshly baked pie. The girl looked awkward, rushing past him without daring to look him in the eye. But what caught James's attention was the way she walked, as if she was trying to hide something. James didn't act immediately. He stood up, casually following her, trying not to draw attention. She walked toward an area that wasn't often noticed, where boxes were placed in a dark corner, a sign that something wasn't right. James knew that he might have found something important. When the girl turned her back, he quickly observed the boxes. One of the boxes had a label that he immediately recognized: Liberty Orchard Imports. Why this name appeared here was as clear as a guiding sign. That was a supplier he had never approved. It was a name James had never seen on any of his store's ingredient lists. What did this mean? Who decided to choose this supplier? And why were substandard ingredients being brought into the store without anyone knowing? James didn't say a word. He silently took a picture of the label. The pie he had tasted earlier now became clearer than ever. This wasn't just a minor issue with ingredient quality. This was deception. He couldn't sit still any longer. James pulled his phone out of his pocket, unlocked it, and quickly sent a message to Dana Cross, the person he trusted to check information quickly. The message came back almost immediately. Liberty Orchard, not in the system. Registered last year in Delaware. The owner is Charles Polson. James felt a chill run down his spine. The name Polson, that was Karen Polson's name, the manager of the store. No longer a simple mistake, this was a connection too obvious to ignore. James clenched his teeth, determined not to let everything slide easily. He had no more doubts. This wasn't poor management. It was a carefully crafted plan. Fake products, wrong decisions, and now the people responsible for this downfall. James knew that to restore this store, he would have to do one important thing. James could no longer sit still. He felt the weight of his responsibility bearing down on him, not just because he owned the store, but because of what had been forgotten: the trust of customers, the dedication of employees, and the values of the brand he had built from the ground up. The pies had become a symbol of trust, care, and quality, but now they were symbols of deceit, of a failure to maintain what he had started. Looking out the window, he saw the daylight fading, and the darkness began to cover the space. This suffocating feeling wasn't just from discovering the deception in the production process, but from the silence of those who might have known but didn't dare to speak up. Everything around him was silent, as if everyone was waiting for a revolution, for a sudden change to awaken them from the suffocating atmosphere they had endured. James stood up, determined not to let himself be further affected by emotions. He quietly walked into his office and pulled out his employee badge. A decision had been made in his mind. He wasn't just going to remove the deception at the store level. He needed the whole system to feel the change. Everyone would know that honesty, quality, and trust had to be restored from the inside out, without exception. He called Dana once more. To make everything clear, he needed a detailed and decisive plan. He couldn't let these people continue to deceive not only the customers, but also everyone who had trusted the brand. He had to remove them, those who had tarnished the name he had built with sweat and effort. Dana, I need you to prepare all the documents related to Liberty Orchard and the connections to Karen Polson, James said, his voice unwavering. Get all the necessary evidence. I won't stop at just eliminating one supplier. I'm going to clean up everything, from top to bottom. Dana didn't ask many questions. She understood that James had made his decision, and there was no turning back. She knew that in the business world, decisions like these could create crises. But if they didn't act immediately, everything would be destroyed. Putting the phone down, James looked back at the restaurant. The employees were working, completely unaware of what was happening. They continued with their jobs, not realizing that they might have become part of a fraud they didn't even recognize. Every look, every step they took was filled with anxiety they hadn't dared to acknowledge. This wasn't a change that could happen overnight. It was a battle to restore the values that had been violated. James knew that to regain the trust of customers, he would need to do more than just handle the ones responsible. He needed to teach everyone in the store about honesty, about working not just for profit, but for the respect of themselves and the people they served. He began to write a list of steps to take. What James was preparing wasn't just a purge, it was a deep restructuring. The deceivers would be removed, and the remaining employees would be guided onto a new path, where every worker would know that what they did had far more significance than just receiving a paycheck. James took a deep breath, feeling the determination within him. He knew that no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, he would never give up, not for fame or profit, but because he couldn't let the values he fought to build be erased. This battle wouldn't just be for him. It was a battle for honesty, for every employee in the store, and for all the customers who had placed their trust in his product. They would know that when James said quality and trust were core values, he truly meant it. James stood in the meeting room. Before him were documents, reports, and irrefutable evidence. Everything had been prepared, but he knew this was just the beginning. The heavy feeling in his chest wasn't from anger, but from deep disappointment. What had happened in the store wasn't just about a few people. It was a corrupt system that had taken root in every corner of the company. He looked at the faces around him. The members of his team were all waiting for his instructions. They all knew that this change would not be easy, but it was an opportunity to rebuild trust from the rubble left behind by the betrayers. James turned his head to look at the signs on the walls. The name of the company boldly printed, Golden Hearth, the golden flame. But now that flame had been drowned in the darkness of deceit. No one in the room spoke a word. James pushed the documents aside and stood up. All eyes turned to him. He began to speak, his voice calm but heavy with weight. We're not just facing a mistake, we are facing a deep crisis. This is not just about a few employees making mistakes. This is about us losing the very essence of this company, trust. Without trust, we have nothing. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, letting his words sink in. Everyone was silent, hanging on every word, because they knew James wasn't speaking lightly. He looked at the people who had worked beside him for years, at the people he had once trusted, and he could feel the change beginning. This is my final decision. No one in this company will be allowed to continue working here unless they commit to returning to our core principles. Honesty and quality, James said. I'm starting by removing everyone directly involved in this situation, including Karen Polson. What she did is unacceptable, not only because she betrayed me, but because she betrayed all the people who trusted us. James paused for a moment, letting his words resonate. The weight of what he was saying didn't lighten, but he felt the clarity in his decision. It was time to take real action, not just talk about change. We will not stop at removing the individuals involved. We will implement a stricter process for vetting. Everything must be transparent. No one will work here unless they are committed to the vision we built from day one. He continued, his gaze sharp and resolute. A few seconds passed and no one spoke. But James knew his words had awakened a sense of commitment within the group. They could no longer go back to the old ways. He didn't just want to rebuild trust, he wanted to rebuild from the ground up. From now on, we will overhaul the entire work culture here. Every employee must be retrained on respect and customer care, not just for the company's benefit, but for the trust our customers have placed in us. Every decision from now on will be based on transparency and ethics. Just then, James's phone buzzed. He knew Donna had new information. He picked up his phone and opened the message from Dana. The information on Karen Polson has been verified. She is the source of this entire fraudulent system. Everything stems from her. James nodded, his determination growing stronger. This isn't just my fight. This is our fight, he said, looking at each person in the room. We can't let this happen again. No one will leave here without taking responsibility for what's happened. With renewed resolve, James returned to the desk and continued his work. He wouldn't just clean up one store. He would go to every department of the company, remove every trace of deceit, and rebuild from the most basic principles: honesty and respect. James stepped out of the meeting room, the weight of the moment still heavy on him. Everything seemed to have been decided, but he knew that the real work was just beginning. Everything in the company had been disrupted, but now his task wasn't just to fix what had been broken. He had to rebuild from the foundation, so what had been lost could rise again, stronger than ever. He walked down the office hallway, observing the faces of employees focused on their work. These were the people he had once trusted, those who would help him rebuild the company from this wreckage. They weren't the ones who had made the wrong choices. They were caught up in a bad system, and now they would be the ones to help him restore the company, regain the trust of the customers. James paused in front of Karen Polson's office door. He knew she would be inside, and he also knew this would be their final conversation. He knocked and a voice called from inside, "Come in." As he entered the room, James didn't immediately look at her. He glanced at the desk, covered in papers and documents, a sea of paperwork filled with numbers and contracts. All that had happened now seemed like a reflection of failure. "Karen," James began, his voice calm but firm, "I know everything you've done, not just to me but to our customers, and to those who place their trust in us." Karen sat there, her hands clasped together, her expression thoughtful but unable to hide her fear. "James," she said, her voice trembling, "I did everything to keep the company from collapsing. The pressure was too much. If I hadn't done this, we wouldn't have survived in this market." James looked at her, his eyes cold. "You can justify it as many times as you want, but the truth remains unchanged. You betrayed not just the company, but the trust of our customers. You sold pies they believed were of high quality, but in reality, they were fake. And you exploited everyone to profit." James's words caused Karen to fall silent, her face beginning to turn pale. She could no longer offer any excuses. The truth was undeniable. "Karen, I gave you a chance, but you failed not only in your work, but you betrayed the values we built. So I've made the decision to terminate your contract immediately. You are no longer part of Golden Hearth." Karen stood up, her face tense, struggling to remain composed. "James, don't do this. I've done everything I could to keep this company alive." "That's not how you keep a company alive," James responded, his voice stern. "Doing the wrong thing is not the way to survive. We will never rebuild if we continue down that path." With those final words, James turned and walked out of the room, leaving Karen standing there in silence, no longer able to defend her actions. What she had done was now exposed, and everything had become clear. James left the building, not with a sense of victory, but with a firm resolve. He knew that this decision was the first step to cleaning up Golden Hearth, to reclaiming the trust of the customers, and to rebuilding the brand from the ground up. But he also knew that the work wasn't finished. This was only the beginning. He had a clear plan. Every employee needed to be retrained, all departments needed to be overhauled, and customers had to be at the center of every decision. He didn't just want to rebuild a successful company, he wanted to build a trustworthy company where everyone felt respected and heard. James looked up at the sky, feeling a new wind blowing. This company would live again. The change wouldn't be easy, but it would come, and he would do everything to maintain the trust of those who had stood by him throughout this journey. A new employee approached James, looking at the new policy board for the store. "You've changed everything," she said, her eyes bright. "We're proud to work here." James smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "You are the ones who made this change, not me." And in that moment, he knew that, no matter how many hardships the company had faced, no matter how many failures, this recovery would be the proof of what they had overcome. And for James, that was the greatest victory. James stood in front of the Golden Hearth store, where he had started this challenging journey. Looking at the shiny sign hanging on the door, he felt a noticeable difference from the previous days. Today, Golden Hearth was no longer just a place to sell products. It had become a symbol of restoration, trust, and transparency. He entered the store with a sense of steadiness like never before. There was no fanfare, no grand reopening of the company. Everything happened smoothly, quietly, yet powerfully. The new employees, those who had witnessed the changes over time, were working diligently to restore the values James had revived for the company. Inside the store, the atmosphere was less tense, no longer filled with suspicion from the customers or employees. They smiled, they engaged with each other, no longer staring at their phones or avoiding interaction. Warmth was slowly returning to every corner of the store. James saw Tasha at the counter, talking to a customer. There was no longer any avoidance, no more side glances. She was talking to the customer as though they were old friends, and that truly made James proud. "We're not just selling products here," Tasha told the customer, her voice full of confidence. "We serve you because you deserve to be treated that way." Those words echoed through the air, each one meaningful, not just about the product, but also about the relationship, about the trust they had rebuilt from the ashes of failure. And James, watching this scene, knew he had done the right thing. The employees were also adjusting to a work environment where there was no fear anymore. They could feel the change, not because of new rules, not because of product improvements, but because of the work spirit. They no longer had to fear being reprimanded or criticized whenever they made a mistake. They had earned respect and fair evaluation from the company they worked for. James walked past the shelves, lightly running his hand over the products, looking at the price tags that were placed clearly, transparently, with no hidden labels, no unclear origins like before. Everything was thoroughly checked, every product had certification, and every ingredient had a traceable code. Everything had changed. A sense of calm and pride swept over him with each step. What he had once seen, what he had once felt inside his own store, now belonged to the past. He no longer had to worry about silent conversations between employees, no longer had to fear the lies whispered in the dark. Everything had been cleaned up, every counterfeit pie had been removed. But this restoration wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. James knew that the journey ahead was still long, but at least now he could breathe deeply and see a brighter future. Not just for the company, but for the employees, the customers, and for everyone who had trusted in the real value of Golden Hearth. A new employee walked up to James, looking at the announcement board for the store's new rules. "You've changed everything," she said, her eyes lighting up. "We're proud to work here." James smiled, his eyes full of pride. "You are the ones who made this change, not me." And in that moment, he knew that, despite all the struggles the company had faced, despite all the failures, this restoration would be the proof of what they had overcome. And for James, that was the greatest victory. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.